Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana, I'm particularly pleased to welcome all participants to today's edition of our distinguished guest lecture series. I'm certain that all of you are very anxious in the light of recent events in the sub-region. And so we thought it would be timely to create a platform as the authority of heads of states and government have since this morning been discussing what their response to this emerging trend is. We want to express our gratitude to Professor Jibril Ibrahim, whom many of you know, for accepting to be our distinguished speaker today. Fortunately, the chairperson of the Council's Research Committee, Professor Emerita Techua Menu, who also happens to be a very good friend of Jibo. So if Techua, if you're online, will you be kind enough to introduce our guest speaker today? Techua, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President, and thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to this distinguished speakers forum. And I note in particular that our big brothers and sisters are very well represented, and we are very grateful. In such enterprises, we need all the family together. So we are really happy that we have a formidable turnout from our big brothers and sisters and neighbors. So I'm proud and pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker this afternoon. Professor Jibril Ibrahim, popularly known as Jibo, is a senior fellow with the Center for Development in Abuja, Nigeria. He was the director of the Center for Development and Democracy and Development, and is an outstanding scholar activist. That's how I first got to know him, with an international reputation. Professor Ibrahim received degrees in political science from the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria, and a doctorate in politics from the University of Bordeaux in France. He was professor of political science at Babcock University, Ilishan, and a research fellow at the Institute of Federalism in Freiburg, Switzerland, among several other academic accomplishments. Professor Ibrahim has lectured, published, and consulted extensively on democratization and governance in Africa. He's a well-regarded leader in civil society and was the chair of the West Africa Civil Society Forum. He was also a member of the Electoral Reform Committee established by President Umaru Yar'Adua, and has observed elections in Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi, Togo, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Guinea for the Center for Democracy and Development. The ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the Carter Center, and the Commonwealth Secretariat. Professor Ibrahim has been the founding director of Global Rights in Nigeria, the international human rights NGO, and served in the leadership of several national and international advocacy and research networks for constitutional reform, electoral reform, and civil society strengthening. He has published many books, monographs, and articles in referee journals, and has consulted extensively for the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Nigeria, the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, the Institute of Strategic Studies, Abuja, the Presidential Committee on Northeast Initiative, the National Broadcasting Commission, the World Bank, UNDP, DFID, now the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, or whatever it's called, among many other agencies, and has also sat on many editorial boards of learned journals. So you will agree with me, Mr. President and distinguished participants, that we could have no better person to speak to us this evening on this really burning topic. And I think that it is apt and fitting that as our heads of states are conferring, that civil society is also putting its head together. So Jibo, welcome. You are only a screen away, so I cannot offer you the usual hospitalities, but you're welcome all the same.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Emeritus. Jibo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this invitation to address your prestigious council. I was quite surprised and pleased to see how widely the invitation was distributed, because I saw it all over the place. And of course, part of the reason why people are very keen on this topic is that it's very current, and that West Africa is seriously reflecting about what's happening to its politics. Earlier this week, we all held our breath at the attempted coup in Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau, we all know to be a country, Guinea-Bissau, we all know to be a country that has a long history of coups and attempted coups. And in a sense, it symbolizes what has happened to the West African states, even if it's a bit extreme, given the nature of the Guinea-Bissau state as essentially a narco state, where drug traffickers struggle against the democratic order so that they can ply their trade without disturbance, as it were. So the battle line is really this group seeking profit through nefarious activities, and the people trying to have a say in how they are governed. If that coup had succeeded, it would have had a significant demonstration effect on other countries where the military is rising up to the fact that they are back, as it were, on the agenda, and that people are peeping at them to see what is the future. For West Africa, with 15 countries, and with a regional strategy that has focalized now on a clear strategy that when there are disturbances to the democratic order, do nothing. When there is constitutional crisis, do nothing. When a coup occurs, do something, suspend them, remove them from the organization temporarily, and carry out certain sanctions. The problem with that West African strategy is that, of course, it cannot be effective because it waits for the worst possible outcome to happen and then tries to offer medicine after death. And that's why all over the region, people are pissed off with ECOWAS. They feel it is not aligned to the realities of the region. They feel it is not proactive in its activities. And they feel it has really nothing to contribute towards democratic consolidation. My own point of entry is that essentially the West African citizen is posing an important question. What value do I get from this democracy that returned in the early 1990s? What are the democratic dividends for the citizen that I am? And whenever the citizen poses that question, the response they come up with is that nothing much. Even something as basic as security is essentially absent. The welfare of the citizen is not a priority in terms of governance. What the West African citizen sees, therefore, is a political system in which the whole system works for the political class that are well paid, that enjoy a lot from state resources, and who display arrogance and complete lack of concern about the welfare of citizens. And it is really this core concern of the citizen that's posing the interrogations that are leading to the search for alternative system. In that search, we do have a very young population, and although it's only very recently that we came out of between 25 and 35 years of military rule, depending on which country we are talking about, we already have in West Africa a generation of young people that have no lived experience of military rule, and therefore have some of the types of notions much earlier generation of Africans had. For those of us who studied political science in the 1970s, one of the most important texts in all our universities was Samuel Huntington, who pushed the thesis of the military as a modernizing force that could stabilize society, bring order, bring development. And for that reason, in the 70s and early 80s, there was significant support for military rule. What eroded support for military rule was the practice of military rule itself. When citizens discovered that the military were not just as bad as the previous civilian rulers people were complaining about, they were actually worse. And it is on that basis that the fight against military rule started. In that context, how do we understand the best approach in terms of confronting this justification that's emerging for military rule? My sense is that the present problematic we are facing is that ECOWAS, that has been our own regional organization and has in previous epoch played a huge role in trying to consolidate democracy, has changed significantly its behavior on the matter. Specifically, ECOWAS does not respond when constitutional coups occur for tenure elongation in West African countries. Secondly, ECOWAS does not respond when massive electoral fraud is organized to delegitimize elections and political processes in West African countries. It has narrowed its intervention to the worst case scenario, which is the emergence of a military coup. And like I said at the beginning, the problem with this approach is that you wait till it is no longer possible to act proactively, and then you try to efficacy is definitely no longer on the agenda. The change in ECOWAS behavior, I feel, can be documented. And I'll use a few minutes to do that. But before doing that, let me just make the point that the current return of democracy in West Africa occurred following the National Conference in Benin Republic. And in the period 1990 to 1993, most West African countries either changed from military or from single-party rule to multi-party democracy, and formal constitutions emerged. It's easy to set up formal democracy. The challenge is always, how do you ensure that constitutionalism underpins that constitution and formal democratic institutions? I think that has been the challenge, and that's where the West African democratic failure has occurred. I'd want to, however, draw our attention to the fact that 30 years of military rule impacted significantly on West African society and culture. Specifically, its approach to governance based on force of arms implanted in the minds of West Africans that if you have arms, you can do whatever you want and get away with it. One of the reasons people clamored for democracy in the 1980s was that many West African countries had degenerated into war-torn countries in which civilian actors have procured arms and were engaged in large-scale revolts, struggles, or simply widespread banditry against the population. And the culture of the Kalashnikov as the weapon of choice had spread around. I think it's something we do not reflect sufficiently upon, because one of the things that strikes me as a political scientist is that if you take any of our West African countries and read the classic books written about the nationalist parties that led us to independence in the 1950s, one thing stood out against on all these parties. They were parties with grassroots support and grassroots membership. All those parties had members at the local level. Those members met regularly. Those members contributed to finance the political party. And in that sense, therefore, the allegiance of the political elite was towards these grassroots members who are responsible for financing the parties in the first place. You go back to the 15 countries in West Africa today and see how political parties organize. Their mode of organization has changed dramatically. There is a massive decline in grassroots membership. Party members no longer fund political parties. Where power, naked power, thugs, money are used to impose candidates. And the representativeness of these parties is therefore no longer based on the people. And I think this is really an important issue to reflect about. That there is today something significantly wrong with our political system. And part of it is that our political parties are themselves militarized in a significant manner. And that therefore militarization was not just on the formal level, but also in terms of popular culture. And that some of the results of the deterioration of political values we are talking about are linked to these changes. My basic concern, therefore, is that it is important to look at the changes that occur, not just within the military and the political establishment, but also within the population, where increasingly militarized action finds justification. I think at the level of West African community, the approach of ECOWAS, especially in the period of the initial democratization, has been to play a positive and proactive role in trying to consolidate democratic values and democratic culture. And I think the Supplementary Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance is the major instrument that was designed for that purpose. The West African governments used that instrument, the Supplementary Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, to try to keep the members of ECOWAS on the straight and narrow line of democracy. And I think it's important to look at some of the examples of how ECOWAS responded at that time. I think the key turning point in this regard is 2005. And two major things happened in 2005. One was in Cote d'Ivoire, where then President Gbagbo, after his second term in office, decided he's not going to hold any elections because he had no guarantee he would win. And that, of course, as we all know, led to the major crisis in the region, the split in the country into two. And throughout the 5 years between 2005 and 2010, ECOWAS accompanied the process, persuading political forces in Cote d'Ivoire to accept the principle of a return to democracy until that happened in 2010. The second thing that occurred in 2005 was the death of President Yadema of Togo. Immediately he died, we all remember that his son simply took over and announced himself president. ECOWAS was upset and decided to act. The president of ECOWAS at that time was Tanja Momodu, the president of Niger. Came to Abuja, discussed with Obasanjo, and the two of them went over to Lomé and told that, look, your constitution says the president of the National Assembly takes over. You cannot just take over. Institutions are important, constitutions are important, and we must respect them. They forced him to step down and to organize elections. Of course, the story of the elections that took place in 2005 is another story that we cannot go into now. But what is interesting and where the West African crisis started was 5 years after the Togo visit. President Tanja, who led the mission to Togo and said we must follow the constitution, his own tenure ended in 2010. And he simply decided he wasn't going to step down as the constitution requires. The issue, of course, was they had just discovered oil, and he had this brilliant finding that he was the only one with enough sense of responsibility to use the oil wealth properly, and therefore it will be irresponsible of him to step down from power. ECOWAS acted in a very decisive manner. They told President Tanja, you led the mission to Togo. In your own case, you even went to your constitutional court and asked them to support your decision not to hold new elections and to change the tenure clause in the Constitution. They told you you cannot change that clause because it came with a provision that it cannot be changed. Therefore, you have to step down. Of course, he said he wouldn't step down. ECOWAS took an unprecedented step in 2010 and announced it no longer recognized Mamadou Tanja as president of Niger. And that created massive local dynamics as citizens in Niamey and other cities in Niger came out in the streets and started daily demonstrations that created the conditions for the departure of Tanja. Salou Djibo, the head of the army, organized a coup to allow for elections. And it was through that method that this idea of the army coming in to create conditions for the return of democracy started spreading. I think when you look, therefore, at these problems that had started emerging since 2005, it created conditions where the legitimacy of so many West African states became very much questioned. In Guinea, as we recall, there was the adventurer coupists that took over power. He was forced out, there was elections, Alpha Conde, who had been in opposition for 30 years, eventually emerged as the president. He served his 2 terms, and at the age of 83, decided he wanted a 3rd term. What did he do when he wanted a 3rd term? He came to Abuja for Salah in 2019. He went to Buhari's village in Daura, sat there for a week. Nigerian media was speculating, doesn't this guy have any work to do in his country? Why is he spending a whole week in Daura? Left Daura, there was nothing said, and the following week declared he was going for a 3rd term. Meanwhile, he had been ruling that country with an iron fist. He had smashed the political parties that existed. He had made nonsense of the institutions, and therefore created conditions which meant the only way of removing him was essentially through a coup d'etat. And this is where I think the change within ECOWAS became very noticeable. When he was doing all that political rascality, ECOWAS kept quiet. Of course, Buhari was complicit. He even gave him a chieftaincy in Daura and all that. And of course, when they went to the meeting of the Authority of Heads of States, nothing was said about it. They waited till the coup occurred, and of course, started issuing empty threats. The question was, what was he doing at 83, looking for a 3rd term in power? President Wade, Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, in 2012, he was 85 years old when he decided he wanted a 3rd term in office. Again, it was massive riots by citizens that were able to stop him. When we look at the Mali coup, it was essentially the same context, essentially a context in which the democratic institutions have been essentially seized by the ruling president, used for their purposes. Elections have become meaningless, were rigged extensively, and therefore created in people this belief that, well, what is the alternative for a government that represents us? Somebody like IBK Mali, he'd been prime minister for 7 years, head of the president of the National Assembly for 5 years, president of the country for 10 years, was 76 years old. What was he looking for? To rule, to rule, to rule. I think here, my key point is that the way in which the political class plays politics in many of our countries in West Africa closes this political space, empties democratic institutions of their contents, and therefore pushes people to find alternative routes to power. And it is within that context that people now either solicit the military, but that's not even the main mode of action these days. It's really simply to arm themselves in political movements and seek political power directly. In Nigeria, for the past 12 years, we've been fighting Boko Haram, which armed itself and decided it was going to establish a caliphate in the country. And we've been unable to eliminate that movement. What has happened is many more armed groups have emerged, and the Kalashnikov today has become the widespread political weapon of the rising masses, the youth who feel completely excluded from political power. The Kalashnikov crisis is a serious one. In Nigeria, for example, the General Abubakar Abdul Salam, who was the former head of state and the chairman of the National Peace Committee, in this country, Nigeria. And they came up with a figure of 6 million people. There are 6 million guns in the hands of private people in Nigeria. Nigeria's security forces total are less than 500,000. So there's a sense in which there's a major shift that has occurred in society. And the more this crisis deepens, the more difficult it is to address the problem. In my discussion, I've decided to not emphasize the question of geopolitics, because I feel in a sense, it's not the central issue. I do know it's very much in the news, and a lot of debate is centered around the geopolitics of what's happening. The most sexy news that has emerged in the last week was the expulsion of the French ambassador to Mali. As we all know, the French hold absolute sway over their new colonies in West Africa, and they don't tolerate any disobedience. Since the Sékou Touré saga of 1958. So now they are suddenly confronted with new players in the region, and these new players are showing they are developing routes that could challenge the roots of the imperial power. I think on this issue, it's important to reflect what's really the underlying issue that's important. I was in Mali in 2013, just after the French moved in. You recall what happened in 2013. The jihadists were conquering territory in northern Mali. They started moving southwards. From the southeast, were moving west to take over Bamako. ECOWAS decided to intervene and had a logistic problem. They discussed with their Western friends, and the Americans in particular said, okay, fine, we'll help you, but we don't want you to go there and abuse human rights. We are going to send human rights trainers to train you for 1 year on how to respect human rights. After that, we'll give you the logistics to go to Mali. The jihadists, of course, had this announcement and said, thank you very much. And they used that as an excellent opportunity to move into Mali. And that was when they made their move on Bamako. Once the jihadist column was en route to Bamako, the Malian government had no choice but to call on France because no country in West Africa had the capacity to intervene. I remember at that time, Nigeria said it could offer 500 troops only. This was the Nigeria that was sending thousands of troops to Liberia and Sierra Leone at an earlier epoch, and was able to create world history. It was the intervention of Nigeria in Liberia and Sierra Leone and the support it received from ECOWAS that established what was later to become a United Nations normative value of the responsibility to protect your neighbor when in trouble. So that same Nigeria was saying, well, we can send 500 troops soon. The only African country that was able to propose significant troops was Chad, which was able to give 2,000 troops. In that context, therefore, when France intervened, it was not so much France exercising its imperial right to intervene, but the failure of West Africa to do what it was able to do previously, to organize interventions to save democratic regimes and protect the human rights of West Africa. So when I went just after that takeover to Mali, I was literally shocked. Almost every Malian was going around holding the French tricolor flag. The greatest nation, the greatest friend of Mali was France. They have saved us from the brutal attack by the jihadists, and they will eliminate the jihadists completely. That was the narrative of 2013. Because 10 years later, the French had not fought the jihadists. They were still there. They were getting stronger. They were spreading their wings. And it was at that moment that the love affair between not just Mali, but the Francophone African countries with France ended. And what we are seeing today is the search for a new love affair. What's alarming about this search for a new love affair is that the new brides on offer are China and Russia. And these are countries who have exactly the same values as France. We want to come to exploit your resources. We are not coming to help you. We are not coming to defend you. We are coming to take over your resources. And that's the challenge that's going to be faced in the coming years. I think there's a huge tragedy unfolding. Some of these militarists in the Francophone countries are having this silly idea that, okay, they will bring in the Wagner group, they'll do the fighting, they, the military, will rule, they'll be governing, the Russians will be doing the fighting, and everything will be nice. I think they are in for a rude shock, and the whole region is in for a rude shock. Following the debacle in Mali in 2013, ECOWAS did an excellent, what they call after Mali assessment. And there are 3 meetings, one in Lagos, one in Bamako, another in Accra, where they examined what were the issues that underlay this inability for us as a sub-region of Africa to act on our own. And I think that report should be read again. Essentially, it was about the irresponsibility of political leadership in West Africa, their declining capacity to carry out their core function of providing for welfare and security of people, and that therefore no search for external support is going to lead to any significant change in the sub-region. It is for this reason that the question of external geopolitics is, for me, essentially a problem of internal dynamics. It's about our weakness. It's not about the strength of the external actors we are trying to bring in to allegedly help us. Let me just conclude by making 3 points. I think what we can learn from what has been happening since 2005 is that countries that succeed in keeping the military out are countries where there is sufficient mobilization of the civilian population to come out and stop civilian so-called democratically elected leaders destroying the democratic order. When they did that in Senegal, when they did that in Niger, when they did that in so many of our countries, there was significant success, and they were able to push forward the deterioration or disintegration of the system. The civic consciousness of the West African citizen is therefore important. ECOWAS has therefore always been right to say a strategic objective must be towards the evolution of a West Africa of citizens rather than a West Africa of states. My second point in terms of the conclusion is that it's important for ECOWAS to go back to its earlier modes of intervention when it was analyzing political developments and intervening once they see derailment of democratic processes rather than waiting till a coup occurred. During that period, a Ghanaian, who some of you might know, headed ECOWAS. Maybe we should always ensure a good Ghanaian heads ECOWAS so that we can benefit from some of the Ghanaian democratic values and cultures. Whenever I go to Ghana, I find my Ghanaian friends are always extremely critical of Ghanaian democracy. And I tell them, you are doing fairly well, but I'm glad you are very critical, because the moment you stop being critical, things deteriorate. So the Council of Foreign Relations continue to encourage your citizens along that line. My final point is that if the military is able to intervene, it's because virtually the entire political class creates conditions that enable them to intervene. One of the knowledges that have been acquired about military rule is that the military can't come into politics except if the political class creates the conditions. the conditions for the entry of the military has to do with bad governance. And we know what those processes are. We know what the steps are. And every day we discuss these processes and steps in our discussions. For the past 2 years, for example, whenever you meet Senegalese, they are always discussing the plans of Macky Sall to do a third term. His tenure hasn't even ended, but everybody knows where he's headed, and he's making all his moves. Why must we wait till he makes all his moves and then precipitates a political crisis, and then we try to respond? I think these are the last 3 points I'll end with. Thank you so much for your patience.
My goodness, Jimbo, you've taken us on a very, very long journey and you've covered the terrain completely. I was particularly concerned about 2 issues towards the end. One of them was that you were suggesting, if I got you right, that ECOWAS should start considering military intervention. Now, if you look at the problem in the Sahel and the terrain that they're covering, and the number of multi-country troops and organizations, how can ECOWAS take over a military response to the crisis in the Sahel? Now, secondly, I was very pleased that you talked about the importance of civic consciousness and the current disconnect between ECOWAS and the citizens. For instance, I understand that from the summit today, ECOWAS did not impose any further sanctions on Burkina Faso. Now, I'm also very concerned about the Kalashnikov Crisis. How are we going to respond to that? But for now, let me rather give the floor to those who might require it. And let me thank Jibo for a brilliant presentation. The Ghanaian that you mentioned is online. And if you want to ask him questions, he will be willing to participate in the discussion. The floor is open. Distinguished, if you just signal from the word. I saw a hand up from somebody called Oppo. If you're online, you have the floor. Abdul Fatal, my friend Abdul, are you online?
Yes, please, I'm online.
Oh, good to hear from you. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, so who is coming on?
Abdel Fattah, you have the floor.
Oh, okay. No, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Jibril Ibrahim, nothing surprised us, about your presentation, because you are actually one of the authorities when it comes to civil society activism, analysis, and all that in the region. So congratulations again on this brilliant presentation. I've just got 2 points to raise, and that we have to ask ourselves why the current coups, why the resurgence of the coups. And I think you have raised those clear issues about while ECOWAS is very, very, very quick in condemning unconstitutional changes of government, it has been unable so far to prevent unconstitutional maintenance of power. And that is by the civilian, leaders in our, continent. The other issue is that, as you say, we in Ghana and others, through bitter experience, and also Nigeria, even Burkina and others, that military takeover is not a solution. And that sooner or later, the honeymoon with the people will wane, and then you are going to see more, repression of the people, and we have to take note of that. But the global situation has changed drastically. And what we were talking about in terms of why can't ECOWAS intervene and then all that. Don't forget, about 70% of MINUSMA, the United Nations mission in Mali, is made up of mainly West African soldiers, in the first place. So, in today's war, you need more technology, more equipment, particularly air power and others, which our countries are not providing. So if West African troops can be within MINUSMA and then perform creditably, why can't ECOWAS mobilize itself? Let's just take the example of Rwanda and SADC in Mozambique. Mozambique was becoming another field, for terrorists, Al-Shabaab in the country. Now we don't hear about it anymore. But broadly speaking, the internal issues have been raised. I just want to raise the international dimension to this. It's because we have a broken multilateral system today in the world, to the extent that when you go to the Security Council, and Mali was a clear example, there was no consensus whether to back the ECOWAS sanctions, and whether to take other actions, because the P3, UK, France, US, always don't see eye to eye with the P2, China, Russia, and they all have different, interests on the continent. Even at the African Union, there was no consensus, apart from a formal endorsement of the ECOWAS positions. Countries like Algeria, Mauritania, Guinea, and others, of course, have said no way. We are not going to impose those sanctions. So today, with Turkey, the Gulf countries, and these countries also in the picture, the coup plotters have got many options. And ECOWAS, the most effective weapon they've had so far is sanctions, and these sanctions are not working anymore. And our own continental behavior, as people are talking about Goita staging a second coup. In fact, the second coup was staged because of how the African Union treated the coup in Chad. Where they allowed the Déby Jr. To remain a head of state. And so Goita said, okay, if you have forced me to hand over to civilians, in the transition, why do you allow Goita? And that's how he came in. So when Guinea occurred, and now Burkina Faso, ECOWAS has removed that element from its protocols about the transition being led by non-military personnel. So that one is off now. It's not working anymore. So we have major problems, and we need to go back to the drawing board. And one of it is the nature of dynamics, the asymmetric environment in Africa, terrorism, which has actually put the whole populations against the wall, and they are ready to go for anybody who promises to save them. This is what is happening. And if we don't come to terms with that, I'm afraid we are going to have more and more of those. There are many more on the call, so let me stop here. And thank you very much for organizing this meeting. It has been very useful.
Thank you very much, as usual. Very incisive and sharing your views. We're waiting for you to come back to join us, leave New York and come and help us resolve all these complex problems. Jibo, maybe we can take 2 or 3 more questions, then you can respond to all of them. Can we start with Gloria Ofori-Boadu, if Gloria is online?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Ambassador DK. I'm just curious, how come all these coups and extension of constitutional rule by presidents and interventions are coming from the Francophone ECOWAS, Or is it because the ECOWAS is dominated by Francophone countries? Or is there a historical reason? Or what exactly? Because it seems to be a Francophone problem as that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I'm sure Jibo has a response to that. It will come in a minute. Now may I ask Ralph Bello Fadile. Ralph, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President of Council for African Foreign Relations. I just want to associate myself with what Jibo said, and we should emphasize and look at that. The internal working of the country is actually responsible. When you have bad government, it encourages the military to come in. I was a military man in Nigeria, and he lay emphasis on that. The government itself encourages the military to come in. And then when you have a bad government, and then the civilians are not mobilized to challenge the political class, then you have a problem. That's just the point I want us to emphasize. Don't look outside. There's nothing coming from outside without the inner people giving them the condition to come in. So we should look inward, not outside, not even ECOWAS. Thank you very much. And Jibo, keep the good job going. I appreciate you again. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you,
sir.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Jibo, maybe you can make a few comments before we go to the next set of participants who want to raise issues. Jibo, you have the floor.
Okay. In response to Madame, let me just recall a dictum by a BBC commentator that used to write letters from America on BBC. And he had this statement that I still remember: power corrupts, and absolute power is absolutely delicious. The issue with power is that it must have controls that are able to restrict the person who exercises that power from doing what they want. That's what the rule of law is all about. That's what democracy is all about, that you cannot do anything you like. Remember, when the second democratic wave spread, it was African leaders that met and took a number of decisions. One of the decisions is that no African leader would be allowed to have more than 2 terms in power.
Yeah.
We took that decision in Harare. Our leaders, nobody came to impose it from anywhere. And some of those leaders that participated in drafting that protocol later came and changed their constitution to have another term, because there was nobody at any level trying to enforce these normative systems that have been developed. And that has always been the problem. West Africa has taken the leadership in developing a normative system for democracy. African Union, its own normative system, essentially borrows from West Africa. So we have the leadership in that. Not only do we have the leadership, we started practically implementing some of those measures, and that's my point about some of the decisions taken between 2005 and 2012 that were very effective in responding to political crisis before allowing a coup to occur. I agree with Musa that the current system is very complex and the international system has changed significantly, reducing our options.
Yeah.
But if we have a clear strategy that we implement based on the realities on the ground, then it becomes possible for us to start recording successes. Nobody talks about it these days, but Yahya Jammeh was not ready to leave power. Senegal said they were sending a battalion, Nigeria sent a warship, and suddenly asked for the pilot of the presidential plane and escaped. There are situations where, like I've said earlier, we don't have the capacity to intervene militarily. If you don't have the capacity to intervene militarily, of course you cannot intervene militarily. It's not magic. These are things that are based on real politics. But there are other things you could do. When in 2010, ECOWAS announced, I remember I was already in Niamey. We had a civil society delegation led by Ali Tin, and we are in a civil society meeting when BBC announced the decision by ECOWAS not to recognize Tanja. It galvanized civil society and citizens in Niger. The fact that ECOWAS is with them. You remember Tanja said, okay, I've left ECOWAS. And then they said, no, you cannot leave ECOWAS. You are a signatory. You are signed, you've been president of ECOWAS, you can't just change your mind. So I'm saying when you take the right actions, you also support progressive forces who are there on the ground, who are trying to act themselves. But when our regional institutions don't show any leadership, then they create conditions where people may give up. And I think there's a sense in which you take a country like Guinea. The reality is that Guinea has not had any democratic experience since 1958.
Yeah.
Except these 2 terms of Condé. And is that a democratic experience? Very limited. I've come to, I used to have a lot of respect for opposition leaders that are dogged and fight for 30 years. President Wade, President Condé. They come to power, what do? They reproduce what the previous rulers did against them. So it means they have imbibed the culture that's fundamentally anti-democratic. And that's the real struggle. What is our school for civic culture, for democratic culture? The schools, the institutions through which we are supposed to expand those are essentially the political parties. And the political party in West Africa today is not a school for civic culture or democratic culture. Money, thuggery play such a huge role that it's the opposite of democratic and civic culture that's been expressed. So we need to create spaces where we can produce belief and above all, learn behavior that contributes to civic and democratic culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jibo. I think a friend from Ethiopia, Joseph Atamensa, would like to ask you a question. Joseph, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and very eloquent presentation. And I hope that, Chair, you will get a copy of the statement so that some of us can read it and read it several times.
In fact, you can rest assured. We just got a request from University of Ghana students in the MA class asking for a recording. So it's going to be recorded. And any of you who would like a copy, we will send you copies because it's such a brilliant presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Prof. Jibo, I just want to ask you a question. I mean, very eloquent presentation, as I said, but you didn't touch on the role of development. And I think the question of this coup d'etat perhaps I think I'm just speculating here. They are in countries where they have very, very serious development issues, economic development issues. And so perhaps that also lends itself to make coup d'etats a bit easy. The other thing too, which I think we also want you'd want to, I would want to hear your thoughts on, how much is the Libyan question, because all these jihadis are coming from Libya with the arms and all that. What are your thoughts on that, and how could we realize that some of these problems not being solved because of that? I want you to take a bigger question in terms of, I was talking to a friend about this morning, and we're all talking about perhaps maybe we bring back ECOMOG, right? And which is something you are alleging to. Do we have the money enough to be able to create an ECOMOG that would go and fight in the Sahel to solve that problem? And because know that most of the countries, African countries, including West African countries, saddled with debt, foreign debt. And where would they find the other resources in order to deal with it? And I think that is an issue. But I like your point about, ECOWAS coming in when it sees that there is democratic erosion. And I hear, these militaries have become very clever too. That when they come in, they don't come in and you see only soldiers ruling, but they come in because they know that they can find civilians who are prepared to come in as hybrid, like Sudan, right? Where you have the military in charge and you have a civilian government. And they'll try and find somebody who is sympathetic. And the same thing is happening in Mali and in Guinea. So the question is, when you have such a hybrid situation and they have the people like Mali having so many people going out and saying they're supporting them, in Burkina Faso, when you talk to friends who are well educated, they say, no, it's okay, the coup is just for a short time and all that. So I just want your thoughts on that. And I wish my good brother, Dr. Chambers, can chime in here, because if I was to ask him a question, if he was sitting in ECOWAS in Abuja right now, what advice would you be giving to Nana Akufo-Addo, who is the chair of the ECOWAS, to see how to prevent another coup d'etat? I thank you.
Thank you very much, Atta. The issue of finance was what I was referring to earlier. Aisha, if you're online, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening,
Jibo,
Aisha.
Thank you, Jibo, for your presentation. It's very enlightening. I have two quick questions. The first deals with the ECOWAS protocols on good governance and democracy. ECOWAS has failed to take two opportunities that I know of, at least, to review those protocols and strengthen them. What do you think are the practical things that people in civil society and civilians, stakeholders in democracy can do to put pressure on ECOWAS to update those protocols? And then the second question is tied to what I can't remember his name spoke about in terms of the broken multilateral system. I think ECOWAS too, as wonderful as it is, as a good example for how multilateral institutions should work in Africa, a good model for the other regional economic communities. That said, ECOWAS does seem broken as well. When you allude to the fact that we've become inconsistent, part of it is because of, in my mind, who the commissioners are, who the head of ECOWAS is. Because as you pointed out, WAD, Conde, they think ahead. They think long-term in terms of what their plans are. And so they put in place people within the ECOWAS system who will block, as I would say Ouattara did, any opportunity for ECOWAS as a bloc to be able to say, don't do this, you can't do this, or to come down firmly on them, while we are always reactive. So what can we do? What practical things can we do beyond reducing the number of commissioners to make sure that those who get appointed to ECOWAS are more independent-minded? People have touted whether we should have a parliament like the EU does. What would strengthen ECOWAS and make it more independent of the heads of state of the same countries that they're supposed to be overseeing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jibo, if you don't mind, we'll take two more questions. One from
Okay.
Nanaya. Nanaya, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Ibrahim, for that insightful presentation. I like your analysis of the internal approach versus the external approach, but I just want to ask, because it seems as if there is a chicken and egg situation here. Now, in the Sahel region, in the countries that have experienced this coup over this past 18 months, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mali, they are also bedeviled with what we call Islamist, militants. So there is the Islamic militants of the Sahel and then of West Africa, and then the Al-Nusrat, Al-Qaeda oriented, militants. Now, we also know that, because of this whole idea of international sovereignty, even states that give resources to African countries to fight terrorism are also meticulous in how they intervene to play a supervisory role. Yet we also know that some of these coups have been motivated by the lack of political leaders' ability to invest in the military for them to fight against these militants. And so are we looking at the issue? There are two issues here. There is the Islamic militants on one side, and then there is democratic consolidation on one side. Now, how do African leaders marry the two? Because the failure of African leaders to deal with Islamist militants and how the middle rank soldiers have been on the foot and have been on the ground and suffering from these attacks, have given them that kind of imperative for them to claim to replace the political leaders. So how do African leaders deal with issue of, and we know democratic consolidation, failure to implement democratic structures. And we should also, be mindful of the fact that democracy does not run on an empty stomach. And so if you want the people if you want the popular will of the people to be accepted, then there must be economic development. Youth, these are the cracks of the issue. People must be given employment. So they do not have the cause to subscribe, to these military coup tendencies. So how do African leaders marry the issue of democratic consolidation and these Islamist terrorists that seems to be brewing, across the continent? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nanaya. I think we will have Rodney. You have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much for this chance. This is Lem Rodney, a student of political science and Ugandan, studying in Makerere University. I want to thank the professor for his presentation. It was very wonderful, and more so for some of us who are so far from the West, Western Africa. We've gotten to know what really is happening in West Africa. But sincerely speaking, talking about the coups in West Africa, I think the response of ECOWAS was a little bit more problematic because its response was more of the political lead heads of states in West Africa trying to work upon things that are really scary to their consolidation of powers, because its response is also an implication of how these heads of states are scared of anything that would really go against their powers or their leadership in their respective countries. ECOWAS, I think, is more pushed by the political heads of states than economists. And talking about, I've seen the professor has been overemphasizing on democracy, and I don't know what kind of democracy is this, but if at all it's the representative democracy, then he has to clear the air on it. And I think there's something that we tend to leave out, because when we talk about the issues happening in West Africa, we have to deal with the latent and the manifest. The manifest has now come out to be the coups that are happening, but you tend to realize that the ECOWAS, just as other regional blocs, even like the East African community, they tend to intervene when something has happened so badly, and they leave out the latent aspects that were really pressing and perpetual, because we are dealing with issues of neocolonialism, at the same time also the issues around the country itself, like the countries themselves, because the people are suffering, they're also complaining at the same time. And yet, when people are against the states or the governments themselves, the military finds a fertile ground to bring a coup or a fight against the state. So I think the states are not so much linked to the military. That's why the military sometimes can have its own conspiracies against the state. So if at all the states are so strong to ensure that the military doesn't go overboard, then the states would really make sure that the military is controlled. Because when it comes to constitutionalism, there is need for civilian authority against the military the military arm or capacity. But sincerely speaking, the military capacity of the continent has to be strengthened, because when you talk about development and human rights, they don't go together. Whenever there is development in some way, it will always alter or go against the human rights in the country. But at the same time, also the corruptions and other human insecurities have to be dealt with. Thank you very much for the time, and I'm glad to be part of this. Thank you.
Jibo, would you want to respond to the comments or questions raised in the last 5-10 minutes?
Yes, the first one has to do with the role of development, that I didn't really go much into that, which is true, but my basic point is that the raison d'etre of the African states, why we fought for independence, is that we wanted to improve the welfare and security of the African people. That was the justification. And the reasoning was simple. If we take the resources that the colonial power was taking for its own development, we could channel it to our people. And that's why I made the point that what the African citizen has been asking about democracy is what has been the dividends for me as a human being? And they don't see it. He raised the issue of levels of development, whether countries with higher levels of development are more susceptible to coups. I find it very difficult to rate African countries in terms of levels of development. You can argue, for instance, that Nigeria is more developed than Mali in terms of more industries, etc., etc. But Nigeria has 90 million people living below the poverty line. So Nigeria is much more fragile than Mali in that context. So this question of the marginal differences in terms of levels of development, I think are not really very significant in terms of the argument. The second question is about this famous legend of arms from Libya. We've been saying that since they killed Gaddafi, that arms from Libya are coming in, they are coming in, they are coming in. And there's no, I don't see any evidence. Yes, at the time of the Libyan revolt, a lot of arms came out, but that was already some time ago. There hasn't been a supply, a steady supply of arms from Libya. In Nigeria, where we have a lot of small arms and light weapons circulating, they bring them through the ports. They are imported from Ukraine and all over Eastern Europe, and they are smuggled in through the ports. So let's forget this legend of arms from Libya. These are large-scale criminal enterprises with the capacity and the resources to smuggle these arms from anywhere in the world and bring it into our countries. And I think this capacity we shouldn't underplay at all. Reviving ECOMOG, I think reviving ECOMOG is for me not really the question. It's reviving the way ECOWAS thinks about its interventions. That's what I'm emphasizing. Are they ready? Is the authority of heads of states and government ready to criticize their peers when they start derailing and therefore put them on the spot? If they are ready to start doing that, and they did that at some points in the past, then we are going to begin to see changes. The economic situation today is much more difficult. Resources are more difficult to come by. The capacity to do a major intervention at the scale of that ECOMOG did in Liberia and Sierra Leone may no longer be there. But there will always be situations where it's still possible to intervene. And I think that's why I gave the example of Gambia, where it was
frozen.
Because they teach lessons. That, yeah, somebody in this region is going to say, we don't accept this nonsense and we'll do something about it. I agree with the point that the military succeeds because they collaborate with civilians. That's always been very basic to military rule. On their own, they wouldn't be able to do much. So they always find civilian collaborators that they work with. On Aisha's point about updating the supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance, I think it's very important to update it and sharpen it. But I feel even as it is, we can do much more with it than we are doing currently. Because it's the same protocol that was used effectively previously, and now we've stopped using it effectively. So it's really this determination and, above all, innovative ways of addressing these issues as they arise that's important. I think the struggle, the advocacy to get it updated should continue. And I think eventually they are going to accept that. But meanwhile, let's focus on how they can use what we have. ECOWAS is broken. ECOWAS, I think, still has a lot of potential, frankly. It has a long history. It has very strong treaties that cover a lot. It can do much more than what it is doing. My sense, really, is that part of the problem is our political class has no training in terms of their own enlightened self-interest. When you rule irresponsibly, or when you allow others to rule irresponsibly, you are threatening the future of the entire political class. And that's what we are seeing more and more of. And that therefore, thinking proactively, taking reforms seriously, building civic culture for democracy are all things that will consolidate the capacity of states and societies to build resilience, to protect citizens, and to create conditions for economic development. And that's the issue that needs to be addressed. In terms of the spread of Islamist militancy, I think it's important to note that, because some people have notions that some of these people are being imported to start trouble in West African countries. The fact of the matter is the Wahhabi ideology has been spreading in West Africa for 40 years today. It's been around for 40 years. It has built schools. It has built universities. Some of the Sufi universities in West Africa are 20 years old and have produced generations and generations, sorry, not Sufi universities, Salafist universities, have developed generations and generations of students. And therefore, society has been impregnated by these ideologies. And part of the crisis of West African society has to do with the very significant religious change that have occurred in the past 40 years, both in Christianity and Islam. Wahhabism in Islam and Pentecostalism in Christianity have converted 25 to 30% of adherents in West Africa in the past 40 years. This means they have split families. This means there are multiple religious authorities. This means it is possible to corner people and pump all sorts of ideologies into their heads. And that therefore, it is something that's internal and profound in our own societies. My position, therefore, is this type of behavior we are seeing. In Boko Haram, for example, people ask, there's so many cases of somebody will take a knife and slaughter his father because he's in the wrong type of Islam. How can a human being do that? A human being can do that because of the religious change that has impregnated these communities, and people have imbibed the values of enemies on the one hand and brothers on the other, and enemies are to be destroyed. The fact that that enemy is your own personal father then becomes largely incidental and does not come into the bargain. The final question is what type of democracy I'm talking about. I'm talking about representative democracy, multi-party democracy. That's the democracy African countries adopted and have been struggling to consolidate. That's the democracy that has been having lots of problems. And up to this point, we haven't seen other forms of democracy that offer better promise. So I feel that we need to get that form of democracy to work better in our society. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and listeners.
Prof, I want to thank you. But before that, there was just one more person who would raise his hand. Frank, if you're still with us, you have the floor for your question. As you know, Jibo is bilingual. And I know you're Francophone, so you can even ask your question in French. Frank, please take the floor. Frank, are you still with us? Not Frank Adekum, Frank Osei to begin with. Okay, if Frank is not there, then Frank Adekum. Frank Osei, are you online?
Yes, I'm online. Can you hear me?
Oui, vas-y.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for your brilliant talk. But
unfortunately, you're frozen, so we're unable to hear you.
My main question is this. You talked about the democratic institutions of economic sanctions. What is the aim of economic sanctions? What do we expect it to produce in order to further the idea that we need to stand up and defend democratic institutions? Thank you.
Good.
The purpose of economic sanctions are quite straightforward. create difficulties for the countries that are targeted, and that those difficulties will impact on members of that country, and there will be pressure by citizens on the government of those countries to change or shift their behavior so that those sanctions will be lifted. So it's predicated on the assumption that those sanctions will be effective. But I think there is a consensus that those sanctions are not effective and that these countries are able to go around them, and that therefore the impact is extremely limited. In that case, therefore, it doesn't really achieve very much.
Good. I wanted to also thank those who have sent comments. Professor Tiku, your comment about wealth distribution is noted. Kweku Sechado, your comment about the fact that AK-47s don't biodegrade, but all too soon we have come to the end of an extraordinary session. I'm only quoting one of the participants who just put it on, that Jibo, you have been fascinating, and we're really grateful. I mean, you've covered the whole terrain and compelled all of us to think about how to resolve what we consider to be the greatest problem in the sub-region. We will be making available this on our website, and those who have sent us your individual emails, within a week we'll send you copies. Jibo, once again, on behalf of the council, as usual, you were fascinating, you were brilliant, and we thank you and we look forward to engaging further with you as a Council on Foreign Relations Ghana. Thank you all very much for your participation, and we look forward to meeting you at our next conference. Good night and enjoy your evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.